Thank you very much to my good friend, Professor Hao Chen Sun, for inviting me, and thank you to the commentators and for all of you being here. I know it's a very busy time of the year. I appreciate your attendance today. As mentioned, this is a project called Synthetic Data in the Future of AI. All right, so just as some context, this project deals with machine learning models and training data. So I imagine that a number of you use AI in your daily lives, perhaps ChatGPT or a text image generator. Well, machine learning is one branch of artificial intelligence, and machine learning models discern patterns in data. So they enable applications like autonomous vehicles that can drive themselves and generative AI chatbots like ChatGPT. All right, so in order to do so, machine learning models require enormous amounts of training data to then discern these patterns, make decisions, render predictions, and so forth. And ideally, we should have a lot of training data that should include things like edge cases, so statistically improbable events that nevertheless may occur. So for instance, if I'm training an autonomous vehicle to drive itself, I might want to have some data about a piano falling out of a truck in front of that car, just to train that model to know how to respond to that type of situation. All right, so historically, real-world data has been used to train machine learning models. And so this might involve driving on actual roads. So as Professor Sun mentioned, I teach in Northern California. In San Francisco, you see these cars driving around on the streets with sensors and cameras and radar. It's gathering data to teach an autonomous vehicle model how to drive. We're talking about something like a large language model. This data may involve words, images, and videos scraped from the internet. All right, so in my time today, I want to do three things. I want to talk a bit about the technical and legal challenges of relying on real-world training data. Then I want to talk about synthetic data as kind of an alternative or complementary means of training machine learning models, and synthetic data offers both promise and pitfalls. And then I want to talk a bit about innovation mechanisms to ensure the robust, responsible development of synthetic data. All right, so there are some problems that arise from relying on real-world data to train machine learning models. And so for one, data acquisition can be difficult and expensive, right? So we live in a world where there's supposedly exponentially growing amounts of data. It's very easy to collect in theory. In practice, there are actually some constraints on data collection that are quite important. So for instance, OpenAI, Google, the New York Times, and others have updated their terms of service precisely to prohibit people from using their data to train machine learning models. In addition, data may require cleaning and labeling. So the real world is messy. A lot of real world data sets have data that is incomplete or inaccurate. It has to be cleaned. And for at least some types of machine learning, data needs to be labeled, right? So if I'm training a text to image generator, I might need to label an image of a cow as a cow so that the model knows it's a cow and not a horse. So this involves people actually labeling data. All right, so among other implications, the challenges of gathering huge amounts of high quality training data contribute to concentration in machine learning fields. Large incumbents like Facebook, Google, and Amazon have ready access to data to train machine learning models. They can harvest this data from their own platforms. They can buy this data from external sources, or they can buy firms that simply have lots of data. So because of this, we have barriers to entry. And in fact, these large incumbents can squash or acquire small competitors. And has even attracted scrutiny from our US Federal Trade Commission. The notion that only a handful of very large companies would actually have the resources and data to train certain types of models. All right, so another set of problems that arises from the reliance on real-world data is threats to privacy. Personal information is commonly used as training data. So GPT-3, an earlier version of the large language model underpinning ChatGPT, was trained on 300 billion tokens, that is words or parts of words scraped from the internet, right? So your blog posts, Facebook posts, tweets, articles, a lot of personal information all of this can be used as training data and used without consent. And in fact, the FTC has ordered the destruction of algorithms trained on data obtained in violation of privacy. All right, so a third set of problems that arises from relying on real-world data: bias in automated decision-making and content generation. So training data itself may be biased and unrepresentative, or training data may accurately reflect a reality that has been shaped by bias and discrimination. Either way, models trained on such data can actually amplify and exacerbate that bias. So one example that's received some attention involves Amazon's machine learning-based tool to screen resumes from job applicants. This quickly developed an anti-female bias, in large part because it was trained on resumes, mainly from men, received in the previous 10-year period, right? So the training data set was overwhelmingly dominated by men, and so this machine learning model developed an anti-female bias. All right, so what about bias in content generation? Well, here's an analysis of Stable Diffusion from a couple of years ago. So researchers entered in the prompt judge in Stable Diffusion, which is a text image generator. And typically you get an image like this. So in the US context, this is a judge straight from central casting, right? So older white man. In fact, 97% of judges returned from these searches were of men. In fact, 34% of US judges are women. And in large part, again, is because of a skewed training data set. All right, so similarly, when researchers searched for fast food worker, 70% of images were of people of darker skin tones, when in fact, over 70% of US fast food workers are white. All right, so a fourth set of problems that arises from relying on real-world data is the potential for massive copyright infringement, something that Professor Sun has written about. This is most relevant for generative AI, such as ChatGPT and DALL-E. The training data for generative AI is often copyrighted content. It is trivially easy to get a copyright on your expressive works. And so the vast majority of content on the web that's scraped into and then used for these machine learning models is of copyrighted content. News articles, web page text, photos, graphics, Facebook posts, YouTube videos, software code, all proliferating on the internet. In large part, these are all copyrighted, and they are used as training data to train machine learning models. And so as you may have heard, there have been numerous high-profile lawsuits. The New York Times is suing Microsoft and OpenAI, arguing that millions of New York Times articles, which are copyrighted, have been used to train their large language model. Comedian Sarah Silverman is suing Meta and OpenAI. 80 Images is suing Stability AI for using its images in its machine learning. And so here's a headline from the New York Times from not too long ago: how tech giants cut corners to harvest data for AI. OpenAI, Google, and Meta ignored corporate policies, altered their own rules, and discussed skirting copyright law as they sought online information to train their newest artificial intelligence system. Now, it's unclear if training machine learning models on copyrighted content constitutes fair use. This is the $1 million, I would say, $1 trillion question, but probably not if the generative AI creates competing content. At the end of the day, we have enormous uncertainty, which creates enormous risk for machine learning developers. They face potentially massive copyright infringement liability. All right, so I've talked a bit about the challenges of real-world training data, and I want to talk a bit about synthetic data, its promise and pitfalls. All right, so what is synthetic data? Well, as the name implies, this is artificially created data, such as text, numerical values, images, and videos. And there's often a recursive character to synthetic data. So AI models create synthetic data, which then trains other AI models, and then the cycle then repeats. And research firm Gartner once estimated that by 2024, 60% of the data used to train AI models would be synthetic. Now, when talking about synthetic data, it's important to draw some distinctions. So this talk and this project focus primarily on what I'm calling deliberately created synthetic data. So this is text, numerical values, images, and videos deliberately created by data scientists to train machine learning models. In addition, there's a lot of inadvertent synthetic data. So outputs of generative AI models, text, images, code, etc., proliferating on the internet, right? So when you go on ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion, you produce some novel text or a novel image, and that floats around on the internet, that becomes synthetic training data for other machine learning models. All right, so it's also important to know that there are different kinds of synthetic data, and they differ with respect to how synthetic they are, right? So it's really kind of a degree of proximity to ground truth reality. So at one end of the spectrum, we have data augmentation, which modifies an existing data set. So let's say you have this cute photo of a kitten, you rotate it 15 degrees, you rotate another 15 degrees, you enlarge your data set with synthetic images. So a bit more ambitiously, we also have model-based synthetic data that understands patterns in a data set and can produce entirely novel outputs. One example here is generative adversarial networks. This is the technology behind deepfakes, right? So I could get a synthetic image of Tom Cruise in my training data set. All right, so at the far end of the spectrum, we have entirely simulated environments. So one example is Wabi World, which is a driving simulator to train autonomous vehicles. So every turn, acceleration, brake, accident that happens in the simulated environment generates synthetic data to train this machine learning model. All right, so there are certainly a number of benefits to using synthetic data to train machine learning models. So we have here the prospect of creating a large amount of high quality data on demand. So data sets are complete, they can be automatically labeled, and this democratizes the data landscape. Right? So smaller entities that don't have the resources, like Google or Facebook, might use synthetic data to train their machine learning models. So in addition, synthetic data, at least in theory, reduces privacy concerns. Now, machine learning models can be trained on fictitious medical records, fake financial transactions, and other synthetic data. So for instance, our National Institutes of Health is working with a firm called Syntegra to create a synthetic COVID-19 patient data set. So a very valuable resource for conducting medical research and training machine learning models. All right, so third, synthetic data can mitigate bias and automated decision-making, can fill in the gaps of real-world data sets for underrepresented populations. Right? So go back to my example involving Stable Diffusion and the fact that this text-to-image generator generates a disproportionate number of images of male judges as opposed to female judges. In theory, we could actually use synthetic data in the form of images of female judges to complement the existing data set. All right, so finally, synthetic data can, in theory, avoid copyright infringement. We might train generative AI models on synthetic text and images rather than copyrighted content. Now, one caveat here, synthetic data may simply shift copyright issues upstream. So there are ways in which synthetic data may infringe others' copyrights or itself be copyrighted. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. All right, so broader implications of synthetic data. Well, high quality synthetic data can massively increase the analytic power of machine learning models for good or ill, right? So we might have more accurate disease diagnosis. We might also have more powerful facial recognition technology, more compelling behavioral advertising to nudge us to buy things we don't actually need, more convincing deepfakes and fake news because of high quality synthetic data. So this project focuses primarily on harms from low quality synthetic data. And there are a number of ways in which synthetic data can be of low quality. It may be too similar to reality. So in fact, it may leak private information if your synthetic data set looks a lot like real world data, it may actually leak private information or perpetuate real-world biases. Of course, low-quality synthetic data may be too different from reality. So for instance, IBM's Watson Health was trained on faulty synthetic data and gave incorrect cancer treatment advice, kind of a worst-case scenario for the use of synthetic data in the healthcare context. All right, so finally, I'll mention that low-quality synthetic data can also lead to something called model collapse. So this is a degenerative process where synthetic data pollutes the training set for new AI models, which then create more synthetic data. This is most relevant for so-called inadvertent synthetic data. So here's an analysis from the New York Times. So a machine learning model was developed that was trained to kind of mimic handwritten digits. And so it was fed initially actual real-world handwritten digits. It then began using its own output as its training data. And so after 30 generations, we get this, right? So blurs, right? So using its own outputs as training data, this synthetic data ultimately leads to something called model collapse. All right, so I've talked a bit about the technical and legal challenges of real-world training data. I've introduced synthetic data, talked a bit about its benefits and its risks. And I want to talk a bit about innovation mechanisms to ensure the robust, responsible development of synthetic data. All right, so before doing so, I need to cabin my argument, right? So in this project, I don't take a strong normative stand on whether or not synthetic data should be used. Certainly there are pros and cons. There are use cases where it's very valuable. I've also talked about some of the risks from using synthetic data. But I think I do need to recognize, or we need to recognize, the coming wave of synthetic data, and this project seeks to enhance its social benefits. So I think, comprehensive regulations are needed. This particular project focuses on just one slice of the regulatory pie. It focuses on how a variety of innovation mechanisms can shape the development of synthetic data. All right, so synthetic data is an input to AI, but inputs have inputs too. And in a sense, law and policy are inputs to the creation of synthetic data. So the balance of this talk will focus on innovation mechanisms, that is policy levers to promote innovation. We'll explore how they can shape the development of synthetic data. And in terms of policy levers, we'll talk about non-proprietary levers, such as those that are based on open source, and then a number of proprietary innovation mechanisms that are rooted in intellectual property, namely patents, which protect technologies, trade secrets, which cover sensitive business and technical information, and copyrights that protect expressive works. All right, so I want to suggest as a general matter, and there are caveats coming later, but as a general matter, that policymakers adopt 3 objectives to guide the development of synthetic data. So one, we want to encourage the provisioning of high quality synthetic data. Secondly, we want to prioritize the disclosure of synthetic data and methods for producing it to promote communal scrutiny and validation. As I'm sure you're aware, AI models in general are subject to a black box phenomenon where we often don't understand how they reach a particular outcome. We can mitigate that to a certain extent if we understand the data that goes into these models. And so I think disclosure of synthetic data is quite important. And so finally, I think that we should prioritize democratization. There's 2 components. So one, widening access to synthetic data itself. And secondly, enabling multiple sources of synthetic data generation. All right, so a few caveats again before I proceed. So the prescriptions that follow focus on producing wide access to high quality synthetic data. As I suggested earlier, there's a potential downside to it. So this high quality synthetic data can enable machine learning models that serve harmful purposes that can fall into nefarious hands. Though disclosure of the synthetic data will help regulators understand how these models operate. All right, so these prescriptions don't displace traditional regulation of AI to promote safety and security. I mentioned I see a number of people taking photos of my slides. I'm happy to share my slides with you. This is not proprietary data, but if you want to take photos, go ahead. And I can send these to some. It's not synthetic. All right, so I first addressed open source approaches. So these are approaches that are modeled on open source software. So here we're talking about open communal development of synthetic data and processes for generating. So for instance, there's an academic consortium called Synthea that's created a synthetic data set of all the residents of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So an enormously valuable resource for training machine learning models in the healthcare space. It's entirely open source. You can access it whenever you want. You can manipulate it, do whatever you'd like. So in terms of our three policy objectives, I think that open source approaches facilitate provisioning without resort to exclusive rights. They inherently disclose data and processes for generating it, and they democratize access to synthetic data. Right? So any firm can go to Synthea, use this synthetic data to train their models. All right, so what are some policy levers to support open source synthetic data? Well, one is direct government funding, right? So our National Institutes of Health, our National Science Foundation provide billions of dollars every year in research funds that could prioritize projects aimed at the open source generation of synthetic data. In addition, there's government procurement. So the US government, other governments spend enormous amounts of money in procuring technology, which involves machine learning models. They also may insist upon the use of open source synthetic data in those machine learning models. All right, so a second innovation mechanism is patents. So patents confer 20 years of exclusive rights on technologies. Now, synthetic data itself is not patentable, but processes for generating synthetic data are, and not surprisingly, we have active patenting in this space for the usual suspects, IBM, Microsoft, Baidu, Alphabet, and Meta. In terms of provisioning, I think patents can provide some marginal incentives to improve synthetic data. So for instance, Mostly AI is a startup. It argues that its proprietary methods for generating synthetic data are superior functionally to open source. Well, in terms of disclosure, as you may know, patents are a disclosure regime. Patent applicants have to disclose their technologies to a government agency in order to get their exclusive rights. This may involve methods for generating synthetic data. I think that patent law could do a bit more in terms of promoting the disclosure of processes for producing synthetic data. I think encouraging in this regard, our US Supreme Court not too long ago in a case called Amgen versus Sanofi actually heightened the so-called enablement standard. This is the amount of disclosure you have to provide to actually get your patent. I think that's useful in the context of disclosing processes for generating synthetic data. In terms of democratization, there's a wide literature that points out that patents enable kind of small standalone research intensive firms. So, the signal example here is biotech firms that rely on patents to protect their outputs. They then license these outputs to larger pharmaceutical companies for commercialization. Without patents, these small biotech firms could not exist. So similarly, I think that patents can enable kind of small standalone research-intensive synthetic data firms that develop processes for producing synthetic data and then license that data to outside parties. All right, so what about trade secrets? So trade secrets cover sensitive business and technical information. Synthetic data and processes for generating it may be protected. In terms of provisioning, I think that trade secrets bolster incentives to create, particularly when public disclosure is not desired, right? So let's say that you don't want to go open source, you don't want to disclose your process in a patent, you might opt for a trade secret to protect both your data and the process for generating it. In terms of disclosure, it might seem that trade secrecy is diametrically opposed to disclosure, but ironically, trade secrets can increase at least the sharing of technical information. Firms may be more likely to share information with outside vendors, contractors, and clients if it's protected as a trade secret. And then finally, in terms of democratization, trade secrets are particularly important for startups and under-resourced entities. So in the US context, it can take, $30, $40, $50,000, 3 years to get a patent. That's a lot of time and money that startups don't have. They may want to opt for trade secrets, the mechanism for protecting their synthetic data and processes for generating. All right, so finally, in terms of copyright, so copyrights cover expressive works. I think these are going to have a limited impact on the development of synthetic data. So synthetic data itself is largely not copyrightable. It's primarily generated by AI, thus lacking human authorship. So our Copyright Office, at least one court has held that you need a human author to create something for that thing to be copyrighted. To the extent that synthetic data is created by AI, we don't have a human author, so we don't have copyright protection. The selection and arrangement of synthetic data may be copyrightable, but protection is thin. It is possible for the software for generating synthetic data to be copyrighted. So we know from relatively recent Supreme Court cases like Google versus Oracle that such copyrights are subject to expansive fair use. All right, so the upshot in terms of our policy objectives, I think that copyright might provide some marginal incentive to develop software to synthesize data. It may enhance disclosure to a certain extent, but this is kind of undermined by the fact that it's subject to liberal fair use. And so, parties are kind of less likely to rely on copyright to protect their synthetic data software. And there might be some minor need to democratization, but I think that in the main, firms will probably rely more on patents and trade secrets to protect their processes for producing synthetic data. All right, so in conclusion, the need to amass huge amounts of real-world data to train machine learning models leads to several technical and legal challenges. So the sheer difficulty of data collection on this massive scale, we have problems of privacy, bias, and copyright infringement. Synthetic data can mitigate, not completely eliminate, but mitigate several of these challenges, but poorly developed and deployed synthetic data can do significant harm. So I've argued today for an innovation ecosystem to promote the robust and responsible development of synthetic data that prioritizes provisioning, disclosure, and democratization. And I want to suggest that a diverse set of innovation mechanisms can ensure robust generation of synthetic data technologies, communal validation of their quality, and widespread generation of synthetic data. So with that, I'll close. I look forward to the commentary and the questions. Thank you.
So the first commentator is our own colleague, Professor Julian Nowak. He's a leading expert in the field of competition law and policy. And the second commentator is our colleague, Professor Simon Goldstein from the Department of Philosophy, and he is a leading expert in the field of AI security. So please join me in welcoming them to give comments.
All right, I have been requested to go first. So thanks so much, Peter. Peter's overall approach emphasizes three big values that he's trying to promote. So provisioning, disclosure, and democratization. And what I wanted to flag in my comments is I think that a lot of Peter's proposals end up having difficult trade-offs that have to be balanced between these three things. And I wanted to hear more from Peter about, okay, actually the proposals he has, they're going to get you one of these, some of these things at the expense of others, and how is he thinking about that? So let's go through a few examples. So for example, the first kind of policy proposal Peter suggested is government funding synthetic data and also provisioning and also procurement requirements. And there, I think, we see some of these trade-offs. So, Peter proposes, okay, if when government funds synthetic data, spend the money on open source and spend it on smaller new AI companies because, well, open source helps with disclosure and spending it on smaller companies helps with democratization. But, in principle, there's a trade-off there with the benefits of provisioning. So the basic idea of provisioning is synthetic data is important, but it may be undersupplied by the market because it's public good. And so there, okay, we want government to step in and make, help have more synthetic data. But when we start putting these extra requirements on all the funding, that could harm the provisioning, because it could be that, maybe labs like OpenAI and Anthropic would actually be the labs that would use government funding most efficiently. But maybe once you put all these open source requirements on it, OpenAI is they're not gonna bid on the contract because they don't want to make it open source. And if it's required to be a small company, then they can't bid in the first place. So basically the worry here would be, well, we don't want the government to pick losers. And if we set up the rules so that the winners won't apply, then, we're not going to get good provisioning. So a second, kind of trade-off would be between disclosure and democratization. So if we, a different thing we could do is just give money to small companies, but not require that it be open source or not have disclosure requirements. And that would weight democratization more than disclosure potentially. So that's just another example. So now if we go to patents, with patents, again, there's an interesting trade-off because, well, maybe having the IP protection gives more of an incentive to develop the technology. So that helps with procurement. But then, and then the thought is patents also can help actually with disclosure because of various legal requirements. But then there's a worry about democratization that, well, what if OpenAI got all the patents? And then Peter suggests at that point, well, maybe, we can make it harder for, big companies like OpenAI to have patents rather than small. And that would come in and help democratization. But then that comes at the cost of disclosure and provisioning because, well, if the thought was that patents help with disclosure, and then if OpenAI can't get a patent, then they're not going to be disclosing, or at least patents won't be helping. And similarly with provisioning, if we think that granting patents will incentivize development and avoid duplication of fixed costs, well, if the big companies can't get the patents, then they may go duplicate all the work and make their own approach to synthetic data. So that would be another example. So I guess overall, I think where I myself maybe disagree with Peter is, I guess, like my view of the AI industry is I kind of think that I expect a lot of the innovation to be coming from the biggest firms like OpenAI, Anthropic, and DeepMind. And so given that background, so basically I expect so much of the talent is there and so much of the investment is there that's where I expect much of the best innovation to come from. And so because of that difference, or maybe that's a difference to Peter. And so then I would be really worried that if government spends a bunch of money on, small companies, then they're going to be not picking the winners. And so maybe that's, I guess that's my main place to disagree, but kind of backing up, I just like a better sense from Peter of how is he making these decisions about how to weigh these trade-offs and how do we navigate that, and what kind of, evidence could we use to really figure out how to weigh those trade-offs. And I would also bet maybe the Trump administration, if Peter went and gave Trump these proposals, and then maybe what Trump would say is, well, what I really want is just AI that goes really well. So yeah, I like the provisioning stuff, but I don't really see a serious market concentration issue here. And I don't see the value of disclosure. So since I weight provisioning more, I will not be following these. So yeah, I'd like to hear more about the trade-offs. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. A really interesting paper. I have thought about synthetic data, but never in that depth. Like a real great paper and fun read. So I'm a competition lawyer. I do competition markets, and so maybe my questions will not be surprising in that regard. So you already mentioned democratization, and then I was thinking, what do you mean by democratization? When I read your paper, I think quite often it seems more like a paper that can be speaking about competition in the market, like increasing the provision, protection maybe of small competitors as some elements of the last kind of approach in competition law of the FTC and so on. So I'm wondering to what extent is there a difference between democratization and more competitive markets? And if I would be speaking about democracy in that context, I would possibly be thinking more of a connection to the citizen rather than to small independent firms and so on. So that was one idea that I had, or one question. The second, and I have basically 4 points. The second one is you laid out how we can think about synthetic data as a form of a public good. And usually you would basically say, well, if the public goods are these goods that are non-rivalous, non-excludable, and so on. And typically we say these are goods that the state needs to provide it. Classical example is the lighthouse. I think we have one there on, I forgot the name of the island, but there's a lighthouse there. And no one of us would put in a lighthouse because it's just, why would I? No one will gonna pay me, and everyone else is gonna, all the ships are gonna have the benefits of that. So private companies typically don't build lighthouses because they cannot exclude anyone and can therefore not charge anything. And if synthetic data is a public good, then we think about it as a public good, then we would have to ask ourselves, why do companies then even create it in the first place? So maybe it's not so much a public good, and we just had a chat. Maybe it is a club good, which is a different thing. So here the question about if we think about it as public good versus the reality that we are seeing that companies are actually doing this kind of thing. And then the third one, third area of comments is around the provision and the quality of synthetic data. So I was wondering, you seem to say that, well, you are not so much concerned, or maybe that's also a concern, but not your primary concern is about increasing the amount of synthetic data, but increasing the quality of the synthetic data that is produced. And you briefly mentioned the regulation, but that seems to be mainly the regulation of AI itself and not of the data sets, the synthetic data sets. So I was wondering, maybe if you want to have some kind of quality standard for synthetic data, maybe we need to set at least some basic rules, like you need to make sure that your synthetic data is not discriminatory, is not biased, or things like that. So that's one. How do you, why would you go, if you're concerned about the quality of your data, why would you go for these tools that you have here? And the final area is and I know how it is with, we all know how it is with publications, right? You write them at some point in time and then things change, and until they are out, they're already, even if you're super fast, they're already a bit behind time. So one question, and that's also forward-looking then. So you mentioned Biden's Bill of Rights for the AI context, but what do you see and what do you expect in terms of the Trump administration and their approach to AI? Thanks again for a very interesting thing.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let's open the floor for.
I'm happy to respond if you'd like, but you're the moderator, so.
Go ahead.
And this will have to be brief because these are wonderfully rich comments. I can't digest and process everything right now. Let me just offer a few quick responses. I think we might be having lunch afterwards. We can talk more. So Simon, thank you for your comments. So in terms of kind of the government picking winners and kind of selecting, smaller entities versus larger entities. So in terms of the federal funding approach, I was focused primarily on kind of research funding that goes to academic researchers as opposed to companies like OpenAI. So, there are some NIH funds, NSF funds that might go to companies, but primarily I was thinking about academic researchers. I mean, this is kind of revealing my priors. I would imagine that a lot of academic researchers are interested in developing open source synthetic data models. Synthea is an example. So I think that there is kind of a confluence between what the government wants to fund and what academic researchers might fund. In terms of procurement and funds even going to private companies like OpenAI, so, in a sense, all data that arises from federal contracts in the US is open source, whether or not the contractee wants it. So there are federal acquisition regulations that say that when the US government purchases some product and that product may involve data, that data can be used by the federal government for any purpose. So in a sense, if OpenAI wants to receive government funding, unless it negotiates a side agreement, its data is going to be widely available. But you raise a great question generally about how to navigate these trade-offs. I don't have a universal answer. Obviously, it's got to be very context specific. I'll just mention that we do have a track history already of doing this to a certain extent. So, you know, the National Science Foundation has been giving grants since the 1950s. The paragon criterion for getting an NSF grant is intellectual merits. But there are political sensibilities baked in as well, right? So there is some desire to spread these funds around geographically. And so we are kind of trading off to a certain extent, you know, merit or kind of technical functionality versus these other distributive concerns. I don't know if there's a principled way of doing it, but I think we can learn from that track history and perhaps apply it going forward. Julie, in terms of your comments, I'll try to be very brief here. I love your comment about democratization, about how, you know, it's really something that should engage the individual as opposed to the way that I'm using it, which is really at the firm level. I think you're right that I'm using democratization in more of a kind of competition context. I do think, though, that having a more widely dispersed competitive field will ultimately benefit democratization at the individual level and giving the individual more choices in terms of machine learning models. In terms of, you know, synthetic data being a public good, so should the state be providing it? You know, that's certainly one model for provisioning public goods, public funding, but the patent system is actually another model of using property rights to allow private firms to develop public goods, namely technical information. I think you're right that, you know, there are lots of incentives already for companies to do this. So, you know, why might Facebook develop synthetic data? Well, to train its own models, right? And so to provide more powerful models, you know, better applications for consumers. So, and I mentioned this more in the piece and in the talk, I don't think we need a lot of incentives, external incentives for developing synthetic data. I think that these innovation mechanisms might make their most valuable contributions in terms of the disclosure and the democratization piece. In terms of your question about quality, you know, as I mentioned in the piece, so I'm only looking at a very small slice of the regulatory pie. I think that there is room to regulate quality here. So one example that comes to mind is with medical devices. So the FDA, our Food and Drug Administration, regulates medical devices. Their medical devices are going to be trained on data that could be synthetic data. And so I think that all of the traditional regulations that apply to those devices should apply to devices trained on synthetic data. And finally, I think you're right that we've seen a definite policy shift between the Biden and Trump administrations. You know, the Biden administration was very interested in guardrails and safeguards and announced his Bill of Rights. Trump, and particularly J.D. Vance, has been very kind of pro-development, which is develop AI, be the world's leader in AI. I don't think that they're as interested in safeguards. So, yeah, I think some of what I'm saying now is a tougher sell now, given the new political environment. But if there's some major catastrophe and the public becomes kind of enraged about this, about AI and its potential, perhaps these arguments might have a bit more traction. But thank you very much.